Spain once controlled territories on 4 continents, commanded the richest flow of silver the world had ever seen, and connected Europe, the Americas, and Asia through a single imperial network. Yet the same wealth that made Spain extraordinarily powerful also helped create the weaknesses that eventually undermined it. So how did the first truly global empire become one of history's greatest lessons in the danger of becoming powerful too quickly?
To understand Spain's rise, we have to begin before there was a Spanish Empire. In the late 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was divided among several political entities, with Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon emerging as the dominant powers. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage did not instantly create a unified modern Spain. Castile and Aragon retained separate institutions, laws, and political structures. But the union created something historically important, a monarchy capable of combining the resources of 2 major Iberian kingdoms. And then, in 1492, 3 events changed the trajectory of that monarchy. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, fell to Isabella and Ferdinand. The monarchy sponsored Christopher Columbus's westward voyage, and the political and religious consolidation of the Iberian kingdoms entered a new phase. The consequences of Columbus's voyage were far larger than anyone in Europe initially understood. The Spanish crown had not discovered a shortcut to Asia. It had encountered an entirely different hemisphere. And within decades, that hemisphere would become the economic foundation of an enormous imperial system. But why was Spain able to conquer territories thousands of miles away across an ocean when the Spanish monarchy itself was still consolidating power at home? The answer was not simply superior weapons. It was a combination of geography, disease, political fragmentation, alliances, military organization, maritime technology, and extraordinary timing. When Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, he was not facing a united American continent. He entered a region dominated by the Mexica Empire, but surrounded by peoples who had their own grievances and political ambitions. Cortés exploited those divisions. After years of warfare and alliances, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. In the Andes, another Spanish expedition encountered the Inca Empire. Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived while the Inca world was already destabilized by a civil war between rival claimants to the throne. In 1532, Pizarro captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa. The conquest that followed eventually brought enormous territories under Spanish control. But the Spanish had not merely acquired land. They had acquired something far consequential: resources. Gold mattered, but silver would matter even more. The discovery and expansion of silver mining, particularly at Potosí and the Andes and later across New Spain, transformed the Spanish monarchy's possibilities. Suddenly, the crown possessed access to enormous quantities of one of the most important forms of money in the early modern world. And this changed the economics of empire. Spain could borrow against future silver revenues. It could finance armies. It could subsidize allies. It could fight wars across Europe. It could maintain fleets. It could defend distant colonies. And it could project military power far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. This was the beginning of a crucial paradox. Spain did not become powerful because it had unlimited money. It became powerful because the expectation of future American wealth allowed its rulers to borrow enormous amounts of money. American silver became collateral for imperial ambition, and imperial ambition created obligations that required even more silver. The system could work brilliantly as long as the flow continued. By the 16th century, Spain's empire was expanding into a structure unlike anything most Europeans had previously experienced. There were Spanish possessions across the Caribbean. New Spain stretched across much of present-day Mexico and beyond. Spanish authority expanded through Central America, South American territories were reorganized under colonial administrations, and Spain pushed into the Pacific. In 1565, Spain established a permanent route connecting the Philippines with Mexico. This would eventually become one of the most extraordinary commercial systems of the early modern world. The Manila Galleons carried Asian goods, including Chinese silk and porcelain, from Manila to Acapulco. American silver traveled in the opposite economic direction. Some estimates suggest that as much as 1/3 of the silver mined in New Spain and Peru ultimately moved toward Asian markets. This meant that Spanish America was not simply supplying Spain, it was participating in a global network connecting the Americas, Europe, and Asia. And that is why calling Spain merely a colonial power understates what was happening. Spain was becoming a global connector.
By the middle of the 16th century, the Spanish monarchy was entering its imperial peak, and then came Charles V. Born into the Habsburg dynasty, Charles inherited an extraordinary collection of territories. He became King of Spain as Charles I, but he was also Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. His possessions and political interests extended across Spain, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, Central Europe, and overseas territories in the Americas. His political problem was almost absurd in scale. He was expected to defend a collection of territories separated by enormous distances, different political systems, rival powers, religious conflicts, and multiple military fronts. And the empire's enemies were everywhere. France challenged Habsburg power in Europe. The Ottoman Empire threatened Habsburg territories and Mediterranean interests. Protestant movements challenged imperial and Catholic authority within the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually, England and the Dutch rebels became major opponents of Spanish power. Spain, therefore, developed an imperial strategy based not on controlling one continuous territory, but on maintaining a network. A fleet here, a fortress there, an army in the Netherlands, garrisons in Italy, ships protecting Atlantic routes, colonial administrations across the Americas, and financial connections tying them all together. The Spanish monarchy was becoming something closer to a global military financial system than a conventional kingdom. But there was a problem. The empire was expensive, extremely expensive. The crown needed soldiers in the Netherlands, it needed ships in the Mediterranean, it needed defenses against Ottoman fleets, it needed troops in Italy, it needed to protect Atlantic shipping, and it needed to maintain colonial administrations thousands of miles from Europe. American silver helped pay for this, but much of the money never remained in Spain. Silver flowed through the European financial system. It paid creditors, it financed armies, it purchased military supplies, it paid for imported goods, and increasingly, Spain became dependent on foreign financiers and merchants to keep the imperial machine operating. This created an uncomfortable reality. Spain could possess enormous quantities of silver and still struggle to maintain financial stability. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than the familiar idea that Spain simply became rich and then wasted its wealth. The deeper problem was structural. American treasure gave the monarchy extraordinary purchasing power, but it also reduced the immediate pressure to develop a broader domestic productive economy. A major strand of economic scholarship argues that the precious metal windfall encouraged rent-seeking, increased the crown's ability to borrow, and helped sustain an expansive imperial policy. When the costs of maintaining that empire increased, the monarchy faced growing fiscal pressure. In other words, silver did not automatically create a stronger economy. It created financial capacity. Those are not the same thing. Imagine a government suddenly receiving an enormous external income. It can use that income to build factories. It can invest in infrastructure. It can improve education. It can diversify production. Or it can use the money to maintain an existing system that is already expensive. Spain increasingly chose the second path.
and the consequences would take decades to become fully visible. At the same time, Spain's empire was producing something genuinely revolutionary, a global circulation of goods. Silver from the Americas could move toward Europe and Asia. Asian luxury goods could travel through Manila to Mexico. European manufactured goods could enter American markets. Merchants, soldiers, missionaries, administrators, enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and migrants were all becoming part of an interconnected imperial world. The Manila-Acapulco route was especially important because it effectively connected the Pacific to the Atlantic through Spanish territory. Silver from the Americas could reach Manila. From there, it entered Asian commercial networks. Chinese demand for silver was particularly significant. Some historians have argued that Chinese demand for silver played a major role in the profitability of Spanish-American mining, and therefore in the rise and later transformation of the Spanish imperial economy. This is one of the great ironies of the Spanish Empire. The empire that looked from Europe like the center of a global economic system was itself dependent on forces it did not fully control. Chinese demand mattered. European credit mattered. Foreign merchants mattered. Atlantic shipping mattered. American mining mattered. And increasingly, Spain's enemies learned how to attack the system rather than simply attack Spain itself.
The first major warning came from the sheer number of wars Spain was now fighting. Under Philip II, who ruled Spain from 1556 to 1598, the monarchy inherited enormous responsibilities and expanded them further. In 1580, Philip II became King of Portugal, creating the Iberian Union. For 60 years, the Portuguese and Spanish crowns were held by the same monarch. This dramatically expanded the territory and commercial reach associated with the Spanish monarchy. But it also expanded the number of enemies. Portugal's overseas possessions became targets for Spain's rivals. English and Dutch privateers attacked Iberian shipping. The Dutch revolt continued. France remained a strategic competitor, and England increasingly challenged Spanish maritime power. Then, in 1588, Philip II launched the Spanish Armada against England. The objective was not simply to destroy the English navy. The plan required the Armada to coordinate with Spanish forces in the Netherlands and facilitate an invasion of England. The operation failed. The Armada was battered by English attacks and severe weather, and many ships were lost during the retreat around the British Isles. But the defeat of 1588 should not be treated as the single moment when Spain lost its empire. That is a myth created partly by hindsight. Spain remained a major military and imperial power for generations. The Armada was a setback, not an instant collapse. Spain continued fighting. Spain continued controlling enormous territories. Spanish fleets continued crossing the Atlantic and Pacific. American silver continued to enter global markets, and the empire continued to expand and adapt. The real story of Spanish decline is therefore much slower. It is the story of a system that became increasingly expensive to maintain while its competitors became better at exploiting the weaknesses of that system. And that process was already underway. By the 17th century, Spain faced repeated financial crises. The crown sometimes suspended payments to creditors rather than meeting its obligations in full. Military expenditure remained enormous. Tax pressure remained a persistent problem, and foreign merchants increasingly participated in the empire's trade, including through contraband. This distinction is crucial. Spain still possessed the colonies, but possessing territory and controlling the economic value generated by that territory were becoming two different things. So what happens when an empire still looks enormous on the map, but its economic system is gradually slipping beyond the control of the state that supposedly owns it? That question leads directly to the next phase of Spain's story, because the 17th century would reveal the empire's greatest weakness. Spain had built a global system that was larger than the economic foundation supporting it, and once its rivals learned how to compete against that system financially, commercially, and militarily, Spain's enormous size became less of an advantage and increasingly a burden.
The decline of Spanish dominance was not caused by one failed invasion, one incompetent king, or one exhausted silver mine. It was the result of a much larger transformation. Spain had created an empire designed around extraction and military projection. Its rivals were beginning to build systems based increasingly on commerce, finance, shipping, manufacturing, and maritime competition. That distinction mattered. The Spanish monarchy could still raise armies, it could still build fleets, it could still extract wealth from overseas territories, but the cost of doing all three simultaneously kept rising, and the rest of Europe was changing. The Dutch were perhaps the clearest example. The Dutch Republic emerged from its revolt against Spanish rule and developed a commercial system centered on shipping, finance, and trade. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became a powerful commercial and military organization operating across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. England was following a similar trajectory. France was expanding its demographic and economic weight, and Northern European states were becoming increasingly capable of mobilizing taxation, credit, naval power, and commercial institutions. Spain, therefore, faced an uncomfortable strategic problem. It was fighting competitors whose economic systems were becoming increasingly effective at generating the resources needed to fight Spain. This was not simply a military competition. It was a competition between systems. Could Spain remain the dominant power if every new war forced it to borrow more, every loan increased future obligations, and every new enemy opened another front? The answer became increasingly difficult. Under Philip IV, Spain entered some of the most demanding conflicts of the 17th century. The 30 Years' War devastated much of Central Europe. Spain remained deeply involved because the Habsburg monarchy considered the defense of its European position essential. At the same time, Spain was fighting France. The Dutch conflict continued until the Peace of Munster in 1448 formally recognized Dutch independence, and in 1640 Portugal rebelled. The Iberian Union that had begun under Philip II collapsed. Portugal eventually restored its independence, taking with it an overseas imperial network that had once been connected to Spain's global system. This was not merely the loss of a neighboring kingdom, it was a strategic contraction. Spain's enemies could now attack Portuguese and Spanish interests through separate channels, while Portugal itself rebuilt an independent imperial strategy. Then came 1648. The Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War and fundamentally altered the political balance of Europe. Spain did not disappear, it did not suddenly become weak, but the era in which Spanish Habsburg power could plausibly dominate European politics was ending. Spain continued its war with France until 1659, when the Treaty of the Pyrenees confirmed French gains and marked another major shift in the European balance.
The strategic center of gravity was moving, and Spain was increasingly defending an older order against states that were building a newer one. But there is another part of the story that is often overlooked. Spain's American empire did not simply collapse alongside Spain. In fact, some colonial economies demonstrated remarkable resilience. This matters because the old story says Spain lost its silver, so the empire declined. Reality was much more complicated. Potosí's silver production declined sharply during the 17th century, but New Spain developed increasingly important mining centers. Mexico eventually became the dominant source of American mining revenue for the Spanish monarchy. So the empire was not simply running out of silver, its economic geography was changing. Potosí was declining, Mexico was rising. Colonial economies were becoming increasingly internally integrated, and an increasing share of colonial revenues remained within the Americas rather than flowing directly to Spain. By the later 17th century, Spanish-American territories were increasingly capable of financing their own administration and defense. That created a fascinating reversal. Spain had originally built its American colonies to serve the metropolitan center. But as the empire matured, some of those colonies became economically powerful societies in their own right. The empire was becoming less like a machine that simply transferred wealth from America to Spain, and more like a collection of interconnected regional economies. This also explains why the phrase Spanish decline can be misleading. Decline relative to whom? Relative to France? Yes. Relative to England? Increasingly. Relative to the Dutch Republic? In some commercial and financial dimensions, certainly. But the Spanish Empire remained enormous. Its American territories survived. Its Pacific network survived. Its institutions survived, and Spain would continue to possess major imperial resources for centuries. What changed was its relative position. Spain did not suddenly fall off a cliff. Other powers climbed faster. That distinction is essential.
Consider three different models of power. The first is the Spanish model: acquire territory, extract resources, protect trade routes, use imperial revenue and credit to maintain military power. The second is the Dutch model: build commercial networks, develop shipping, control strategic ports, create financial institutions capable of mobilizing private capital. The third, increasingly, was the English and later British model: combine naval power, commercial expansion, finance, industrial capacity, and territorial acquisition into an increasingly integrated system. None of these models was purely one thing. The Dutch fought wars, the English extracted colonial resources, Spain had merchants, manufacturers, financiers, and commercial institutions. But the balance between these elements differed, and over the long term, that balance mattered. So, was Spain simply a victim of its own success? Partly. The American windfall gave the monarchy extraordinary borrowing capacity and helped sustain an ambitious imperial strategy. One influential economic interpretation argues that the precious metal windfall reinforced rent-seeking and institutional patterns that contributed to long-term stagnation. But that interpretation should not be treated as the only explanation. Other historians emphasize demographic pressures, warfare, taxation, institutional fragmentation, technological and commercial competition, and the changing structure of international trade. And there is an even more important complication. Spain's silver economy was part of a global market. China's demand for silver played a major role in sustaining the profitability of Spanish-American mining. When that demand and the economics of silver changed, the consequences reached the Spanish fiscal system. In other words, Spain's fate was connected to events far beyond Madrid. A decision in China could affect the price of silver. The price of silver could affect mining. Mining could affect royal revenue. Royal revenue could affect military expenditure. Military expenditure could affect taxation, and taxation could affect domestic economic activity. This was an early example of something we now take for granted. Globalization creates power, but it also creates dependence. Spain had helped build one of the world's first genuinely global economic networks. It therefore became vulnerable to shocks traveling through that network.
There is another reason the Spanish Empire struggled to maintain dominance: distance. Look at the map. Madrid was thousands of miles from Mexico City. Mexico City was thousands of miles from Manila. Manila was separated from Madrid by an entire ocean and the American continent. Peru was even farther away, and military emergencies could not wait for ideal transportation. A rebellion in one region could require troops from another. A European war could demand money that had originally been expected to finance colonial administration. A fleet lost at sea could disrupt an entire commercial route. Every kilometer created friction, and every imperial possession required administration. This was the hidden cost of global power. The larger the empire became, the more expensive it became to defend. Then there was the problem of information. The Spanish crown could issue orders from Madrid, but it could not instantly know what was happening in Mexico, Peru, Manila, Flanders, Naples, or the Caribbean. Local officials had enormous discretion. Merchants found ways around regulations. Smuggling became persistent. Colonial elites developed their own interests, and distance gave local actors room to negotiate with imperial authority rather than simply obey it. The empire, therefore, depended on cooperation. Not every part of it was controlled through force. Much of it functioned because local elites, administrators, merchants, indigenous communities, and colonial institutions negotiated their place within the imperial system. That made the empire more resilient than a simple conquest model would suggest, but it also meant that Madrid's control had limits. And what happens when an empire becomes so large that governing it requires constant negotiation while its competitors become increasingly capable of bypassing its rules? The answer is not immediate collapse. It is decentralization of power. Economic activity moves elsewhere. Trade routes shift. Local elites gain autonomy. Rivals occupy strategic ports. Financial capital migrates. And gradually, the empire can remain politically intact while losing its position at the center of the international system. That is much closer to what happened to Spain.
The Spanish story matters because it challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about global power, that wealth automatically produces strength. It does not. A country can possess enormous natural resources and still become economically vulnerable. It can control territory without controlling the most profitable parts of the economy. It can have a powerful military while struggling financially, and it can remain geographically enormous while becoming less influential relative to its competitors. Spain demonstrates another principle. Imperial power is not a single number. It is a combination of military capability, productive capacity, financial credibility, technological adaptation, demographic strength, political institutions, and control over trade. If one component becomes disproportionately expensive, the entire system can become fragile. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: Spain did not lose dominance simply because it became poor. It lost relative dominance because other systems became better at converting economic resources into sustained power. That is a very different process. The Spanish Empire itself survived far beyond the 17th century. In the 18th century, Bourbon rulers introduced reforms intended to strengthen administration, increase revenues, improve military organization, and make the empire more efficient. Spain recovered significant economic and military capacity. Silver production also experienced renewed growth. The empire was not simply dying, it was adapting. But by then, the international system had changed. Britain was becoming a formidable naval and commercial power. France remained a major European rival. The Atlantic economy was transforming. And eventually, the Napoleonic Wars and the political crises of the early 19th century would trigger a much more dramatic collapse of Spanish imperial control in the Americas. The great wave of Spanish-American independence movements would destroy most of Spain's continental American empire. Yet even that final collapse should be understood as a separate historical process. The Spain of 1800 was not the Spain of 1550. The empire had evolved, its economy had evolved, its rivals had evolved, and the world around it had fundamentally changed. That may be the most important lesson of all. Empires rarely disappear because they suddenly become powerless. They disappear because the world changes faster than their institutions can adapt. Spain was one of the first states to operate on a truly global scale. It helped create transoceanic trade routes. It linked the Atlantic and Pacific. It moved enormous quantities of silver across continents. It transformed societies from Europe to the Americas and Asia. But the same global system that created Spanish power also exposed Spain to competition from every direction. And eventually, the empire discovered the fundamental problem of global dominance. Maintaining power can become more expensive than acquiring it.
Spain's rise was not simply a story about conquest, gold, and silver. It was the story of what happens when geography, technology, finance, military power, and opportunities suddenly align. And its decline was not a single defeat. It was a gradual change in the balance between Spain and the world around it. The empire remained enormous long after it stopped being Europe's unquestioned dominant power. And perhaps that is the question Spain leaves behind. When a nation reaches the top of the world, is the real challenge becoming powerful or learning how to remain powerful after the world is changed?